I'm Emily Baton, a member of the Author Selection Committee, and it is my sincere pleasure to introduce you to Dolen Perkins-Valdez and her book, Take My Hand. Our committee had an immediate reaction to this novel. The conversation started something like this. Did you know about this? Can you believe this? Wait, what year did you say this was? This quickly became a unanimous chorus of everyone should know this story, and let's invite her to the festival. We are simply thrilled that you said yes. In 1973, Sybil Townsend, a young Black woman, is fresh out of nursing school. Sybil is full of optimism that her job at the Montgomery Family Planning Clinic will give the poor Black women of rural Alabama power over their bodies and improve their lives. It doesn't take long for this idealism to bump up against the harsh realities of the job. At 11 and 13 years old, Sybil's clients, India and Erica Williams, are mere girls. Neither of them has ever even kissed a boy. So why is Sybil being tasked with giving them birth control? The repercussions of her first job stick with Sybil for her entire career, and we meet her again as she's retiring and trying to come to terms with the role she played in her young clients' lives. The novel addresses themes of injustice, accountability, redemption, and forgiveness. Dolen Perkins-Valdez earned a BA from Harvard, a PhD in English from Georgetown University, and was a President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UCLA. Both Take My Hand and her debut novel, Wench, which was a New York Times bestseller, received awards from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Earlier this month, Perkins-Valdez was awarded an NAACP Image Literary Award for Take My Hand. Perkins-Valdez resides with her family in Washington, D.C., where she is the current chair of the board of the Penn-Faulkner Foundation and an associate professor in the literature department at American University. Please join me in welcoming the fabulous Dolen Perkins-Valdez. Set your timer.
How do I do it? Press this button here? Just press that?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, how are you? I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Emily. I'm a Southerner, so I would be remiss if I don't say my thank yous. Thank you, Emily, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the co-chairs of the event. Thank you to all of you who are here today. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of my fellow authors, Sam, Tara, Erica, Tess, who else am I forgetting? Nikki, Belinda, and Jean. I want to say, Karen, it is so hard to follow there you are. The funny person, and I always follow the funny person, and I don't have a funny bone in my body, so I'm really scared right now. That was so wonderful. I was asking my table mates about the rat thing, because I live in D.C., and recently my daughter and I were entering a parking garage at night, and a rat leaped out of the trash can and ran straight at our feet, and she screamed and left me, literally just ran off, and she's only 8, and I was trying not to step on it. It was at my feet, and so, oh God, nostalgia for rats, I don't know, in D.C. it's like not easy. Not easy. I don't know, were they mice or rats? They were rats? Woo! Okay. I'm still shuddering from that. It's so friendly. I think he just wanted to say hello. We had a mouse in my house one time, and we could not get rid of him. I told my husband, either the mouse goes or I go. I was not kidding. Okay, here we go. So thank you for being here. I want to talk today about some things some of y'all might already be familiar with. Writing as an investigation of the heart, writing as making sense of some of the stuff that's inside of us. Not just a simple form of therapy, because we all know therapy is a process, but writing our stories as a calling, as a vocation, as an act of the Spirit. I remember once reading an essay by the writer Zadie Smith in her book, Changing My Mind, when she discusses Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. She called it a soulful novel. And she says, even though this term soulful can be seen as somewhat cliche when talking about Black lives, she still thought it was the best way to describe what happened to her when she read that book. Zadie goes on to write, a final shade, the word soulful, like its Jewish cousin, schmaltz, which has its roots in the digestive tract, she writes. Soul food is simple, flavorsome, hearty, unfussy, with spice. This is a beautiful novel about soulfulness. When I'm reading this book, I'm still quoting Zadie here, I believe it with my whole soul. It allows me to say things I wouldn't normally. Things like, she is my sister and I love her. This book, for me, allows me to say things I normally wouldn't. To me, that is the ultimate feeling that telling a story or reading a story can give us. It can encourage us to speak, to give our words new life, to open up. And finally, she is my sister and I love her. I want to say that I only met the Relf sisters, on whom my book is based, last week for the very first time. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I can truly say they are my sisters and I love them. And I can say to you, women of this room, readers of these books today, you are my sisters too. When I began writing Take My Hand, I was faced with a monumental task. How do I, as a writer, help readers feel this kind of connection? How do I create a story that is hearty, unfussy, simple, flavorful? How do I do justice in the form of the written word to my sisters? I had never written a book where the folks were still alive. That was scary for me. And immediately I knew I had to honor the Relf family while also being truthful. I had to honor Mrs. Jessie Bly, the social worker who played such a pivotal role in this historic moment, who was also still alive. And I had to honor Joe Levin, the lawyer who fought tirelessly in court, who was also still alive. In the process, I wanted to write something soulful, something that would open us up. I knew early on that I was my family's writer-scribe, and some of you probably are your family's writer-scribe. These are those of us who are always asking a million questions, who are the nosy kids in the family, who are doing interviews before we even know what an interview is. My own parents were not avid readers of fiction, but they were naturally curious people when I was growing up. My daddy loved to travel, and though he was a bit of an introvert, he was always willing to try new experiences, eat new foods, meet new people. He never tired of journeying somewhere remote. He was an amateur photographer and took pictures wherever he went. He greatly admired intellectual minds, And he was never intimidated by people smarter than he was. He would ask questions. He would patiently listen. He always understood there was more to learn, and to the end of his days, he was asking questions about my work and what I was doing. I was just a little girl growing up in Memphis when my daddy, a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute, as they used to call it, in the 1960s, told me about the syphilis experiment that had been performed on black men for over 4 decades, backed by the federal government, 40 years of black men believing they were being treated for syphilis long after penicillin was available. The magnitude of it overwhelmed me. I just thought to myself, how did this happen? I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. It wasn't actually until years later that I learned how devastating the effects of syphilis are. It attacks your body's cartilage, it attacks the neurosystem. It's just a really devastating disease left untreated. So it was a horrible, horrible way for these men to die. And then after they died, the federal government autopsied and studied the cadavers. My daddy wanted me to know. He wanted me to use this knowledge as a form of empowerment. That is what history can do for us, is what he taught me. He says, this is why you need to know history, because it's empowering. History changes how we even perceive this contemporary moment. It's why it's so important for us today in 2023 to learn it. As we learn what happened to those hundreds of men in Alabama and the thousands of black women and poor women and disabled women and white women and Latina women across the country who were sterilized, and Native women, indigenous women, we can understand a little bit more about our present day. As we learn the history of the Ralph sisters, Minnie, Mary Alice, we can understand the present moment of black mistrust of the medical field. This was my motivation for writing the book, to connect the past and the present, to find a way into this question about how we have become who we have become, the question that Karen has so beautifully just put to us about the state of our current society. I wanted to get to the root of why black women had such, or have, continue to have, such disparate outcomes in their medical health. In the beginning, I knew very little about the Ralph sisters. I knew that I had glimpsed them in documentaries. I had seen footage of them, but I didn't know a whole lot about them. And when I went to my daddy, he knew nothing of it. I originally titled the book The Takings. That was my title for it, which my publisher hated, my agent hated, lots of people hated. And I had taken the takings from the Takings Clause, which is part of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, that states, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." This is the clause that is most frequently referred to in the legal struggle for reparations. It is a struggle that suggests that our bodies have been stolen from us. That echo of the original title that everybody hated is still in the book when the sister's grandmother, frustrated and angry, says, "All they do is take, take, take." From the very beginning, I was struck by the injustice of this story and how it was linked to other major injustices of the past. And so when we started brainstorming titles, which went on for quite some time, y'all have no idea how many titles you can go through, my publicist mentioned, well, why don't you call it Take My Hand, which he took from the gospel song written by Thomas Dorsey, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." I had gotten caught up in the list-making process, but something about that struck me as being right. It held echoes of the civil rights movement, And I knew, being from Memphis, that it was reportedly Martin Luther King's last words before he was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He told his musician, Ben, make sure you play Precious Lord, Take My Hand Tonight, and play it real pretty. That was my title. I just knew it. I began researching the book, and the first thing that really struck me, and at that time it wasn't a book. A lot of times when we start these things, y'all, we don't know what we're doing. We're just following our nose. What struck me was how big a deal it was. It was in every major newspaper. It was in the New York Times. It was in the Chicago Tribune. It was in the Washington Post. It was in Time magazine. It was, the sisters were featured on the nightly news. They had gone to D.C. and testified before a Senate subcommittee led by the late Senator Ted Kennedy. It was everywhere, and yet I had never learned about it, never studied it in school. As y'all heard from my nice intro, I had a PhD and didn't know anything about this thing. And I thought, somebody has written about this, and then I discovered that nobody had written about it. I flew to Montgomery in the fall of 2017 to meet with Joe Levin, who had retired from the Southern Poverty Law Center, but agreed to meet with me. And when I got down there, he arranged for me to have my own office at the center, and I was grateful for that. And he came in, and he says to me, I haven't brought the files out of storage in over 45 years, but your call prompted me to get those files out. And he talked to me, and his memory was razor sharp of everything that happened. And he said to me at the end of our time, because I was talking to him, and I thought, this is amazing that you argued this case at 30 years old. I mean, just clearly brilliant. He said, well, have you talked to Mrs. Bly? And I said, is this the social worker? And he said, yes. I said, she's still alive? And he said, yes. And I said, do you have her number? And he said, no. And then I found her, and I called her, and I invited her to dinner, and she sounded kind of suspicious. And I said, my university gave me funding. I'm going to take you to dinner anywhere in town. Where do you want to go? And she said, I want to go to Red Lobster. And I said, okay. I hadn't been there in a while. I like those cheddar biscuits. So I go to get her, and when I get there, the family is, waiting to meet this random person who's called her. And she had a church member with her to accompany her in case I tried any funny business, I guess. And we come out of the house, and I say, are you driving? I didn't know if she wanted me to drive my little rental car. I said, are you driving or am I driving? She says, oh, no, honey, you're driving. So we drove, and it was far, y'all. Red Lobster was like 30 minutes. And we go to Red Lobster, and we had a nice dinner, and she talked to me, and she's still sort of a matter-of-fact woman. And at the end, she said, I've told you everything I know. But she was still in touch with the Relf sisters, and asked me, did I want to reach out to them? And I made a decision, and I know this is a question a lot of my readers have. I never interviewed the Relf sisters for this book because I just felt they're trying to live their lives. They're in their late 60s. At that time, they were in their early 60s. They lived together. And they don't want everybody writing a story about them coming knocking on their door. I knew that they were living in public housing. The situation was dire. And I just always felt like I'm not showing up at their door unless I have Oprah with me. You know what I mean? And Oprah can wave her magic wand and change their lives. And I had everything I needed. And so Mrs. Bly, agreed that she would talk to them and tell them about the book I was writing. I go back to D.C., I was on fire. I thought to myself, I have got to write this book. But then I thought, well, what do I have to say about what happened as a fiction writer? This is when we start thinking about how you translate real stories into fiction, right? Karen talked about that spectrum between how close we stick to the history and how much we imagine. This is what we historical fiction writers are always negotiating. So I said, I had found Joe. He could certainly speak for himself. I had found Mrs. Bly. She could certainly tell her own story, and I knew the Relf sisters could tell their own story. But what I hadn't found were the nurses who worked at that clinic. And I wanted to know more about them. I knew the supervising nurse had passed away. At the time that this happened, the supervising nurse was actually 51 years old. So she had passed away. I had found her obituary. But I never found those nurses who worked there. And I decided I wanted to explore this question of how was this allowed to happen? If you were a nurse and you had these sisters under your care, how did you live with yourself? I wanted to explore in my book this idea of good intentions gone bad. And in so many ways, my main character, Sybil Townsend, who has recently graduated from college and who this is her first job and wants to save the world, reminds me of myself at that age, reminds me even of myself now. I still sometimes can fall into that, I'm going to do everything I can to help them, and I'm going to rally all of my friends, and we're going to raise money, and we're going to, do this. And that's not a bad thing to be that way. But it can be if you're not careful. And that's what I wanted to explore about how this kind of thing happened among well-intentioned people. That's what the book is about. At the end of the book, for those of you who have read it, and this is my postscript, I have a call to action. And so I wanted to end my talk today with a call to action. I'm going to just stop this thing before it beeps like it did before. The Ralph sisters and the women, the tens of thousands of women who were sterilized by the federal government, many of them are still alive. And it's time for the federal government to recognize them. It's time for a presidential apology. It is. And so just recently, I have been ending my talks with this call to action, because I never know who's in the room. Y'all, there might be some bigwigs in here that can make this happen, that can get me in the White House. The victims of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment were issued an apology by the federal government in 1994, but women were never acknowledged as being victims of the federal government, and there were literally tens of thousands of women. And if anyone has the power to help make that happen, call your politicians, demand that this happen. I would love for this to happen while they're still alive. It's not going to do any good to do it when they're gone. I mean, it will, but it's better to do it now. So that, they know. A lot of these people went on with their lives. A lot of them live in poverty still. But, they never were able to change what happened. And so that's my call today, that we will sort of lift our voices and demand recognition of women I consider to be heroines. Thank you.
So, questions. Where should we start? I'm curious about the choice of the name Civil for your main character. How and why did you choose that name, and was it deliberately symbolic?
It was. I have a very, very good friend I've known for 25 years, and she's from a little town in Tennessee called Bolivar. And she has a sister named Civil. And when I met her when I was, a young person, I said, "Oh, I love your sister's name. That's a really nice name." And she said, "Yes, my mother was a local politician in Bolivar and very active in the civil rights movement, and she, named her in honor of civil rights and justice, et cetera." And I said, "Oh, one day I might lose that in a book." You say these things, but it never happens usually. But when I started writing this book, I knew this was my Civil. And I struggle with names often. Like even in the manuscript I'm working on now, I've been working on it for 2 years, and the main character is Candy, which is not going to last. It's just my placeholder name. And so, but with this book, I knew from the very beginning this was my Civil. Born in 1950, parents wanted her to sort of epitomize justice, and they had high hopes for her. And so, yeah.
That's interesting, and it's not on my list, but so when a character comes to life for you, do you have a whole background for them that comes with them that you may not actually put in the book?
Yes, but I don't know it at the beginning. I write my way in. I feel like characters are the one thing you can't rush. You have to kind of take your time with and get to know them. I can figure out a whole lot of things early, but character is not one of them. So I just draft until I figure out who they are. And then that's why the name takes a while, because I'm still figuring out who they are. And then once I've done a few drafts, I start to think, okay, like this is who this person is, and this is why they're making these decisions, and it all starts to click into place. So I don't like do a character sketch or anything in the beginning. I just write my way into the character.
Great, thank you. What do you say to young women of color today who ask you if this country has come very far from the time when Sybil worked in the family planning clinic? Are we making progress with health equity? The answer to this may be obvious in light of today's political climate, but what would you say?
Well, I will say one good thing about California, y'all are one of the 3 states that have acknowledged forced sterilization in your state: California, North Carolina, and Virginia. Y'all remember that? Did y'all keep up with that when the women in California state prisons were sterilized without their consent? The California state legislature ruled in their favor. They have been apologized to, and they have received, I believe they received remuneration. Somebody in here might be able to speak more to that. But I think, the health inequity still persists in so many ways. But when it comes to sort of reproductive issues, I can say that, like, Black women still experience higher rates of maternal mortality. They still, more Black women, have infants that die. There are lots of ways in which Black women's health inequities persist in the reproductive realm. And so one of the things that I've been talking about lately with a lot of people is this term reproductive justice, which was a term created by Black feminists at a conference in Illinois in 1994. And that is one that is really trying, a lot of community organizations are centered around demanding reproductive justice for women. So when we talk about the debate over the Dobbs decision issued by the Supreme Court, we're not just talking about the decision to terminate a pregnancy. We're also talking about, the right to gynecological care, the right to raise a child in a safe and healthy environment. We're talking about all of these issues that surround, the health of families.
Thank you. In both the novels Wench and Take My Hand, you focus on Black women's stories that are not told in schools. How do you discover these untold stories?
I just think every writer is naturally nosy. Like I said, we grow up and we're the kid asking the questions. One of my daughters, who's 8, I think she's the writer of my kids, and she's always asking me, so wait a minute, how is he related to the second cousin? And they weren't married, right? And she's always teasing things out and figuring things out. And so I just follow my nose. I read the paper, I read works by historians. I like to read academic books. I'm one of those strange people. I like to talk to people like my daddy, and I'll be at a dinner party or something and somebody will say something intriguing, and I'll ask them wait, tell me what you were talking about and tell me more about that. It doesn't always become a book. I would say 20 times that I hear something interesting, it's not my book. Or somebody will come up to me in a book signing line and they'll say, you ought to write about such and such. That's and it is a good story. It's just not my story. Do you know what I mean? And so, but I hear so many book ideas in my daily life that I wish I could write.
Were you shocked when you learned about the forced sterilization?
You know what I was shocked about? I knew that there had been forced sterilization. I was shocked that it was happening to children. I thought it was grown women, and I had known about, people have written about the forced sterilization, and I had followed the North Carolina case where they had acknowledged the women in North Carolina. I just didn't know it was happening to children. And so that hurt my soul, as a mother of 2 girls. Mm-hmm. And one of the changes I made in the book was I made my girls, the Rolfe sisters in real life were 12 and 14, and in my book I made them a little younger at 11 and 13 because I just wanted to further emphasize that they were children.
Right. Right. Thank you. So tell us what it's like to be in charge of Penn Faulkner.
Well, one of the things people think is that Penn Faulkner is connected to Penn America. We are two separate organizations. In our early life, we were connected to the Penn Foundation, but we are no longer. So we are strictly a literary foundation based in D.C. We give the Penn Faulkner Award for fiction and the Penn Malamud Award for short fiction, which is, I think, two of the most beautiful awards in the country, because we often will award, and this is just our reputation, and I think it's the thing that judges bring to us, we award to books that some of the other prizes might ignore, you know. And so I've been with the organization now for, I don't know, a long time, 8 years. I'm about to end my tenure. And one of the things that got me into it was that one of our programs in DC is we do Writers in Schools, DC and Baltimore, and we go into the school, we purchase books for if a teacher requests it, we'll purchase books for all of the students, and then the writer comes in and speaks to the student. And for many students, y'all, they think of writers as dead white men. Like, they don't think of, living writers, And I have, one time I was in a classroom at Anacostia High, and there was a student, it was a high school class, and he was sleeping, and in the front row, and I'm giving my little spiel, and I don't bother him, it's not my class, and, I follow the teacher's lead. And towards the end of my talk, he sort of woke up, and he picked up my book, and he turned it over, and he saw my picture, and he looked up at me, and he said, "That's you." And I said, "Yeah." And then he wanted to walk me to my car, and he carried my book bag, and he had a million questions. And I just thought to myself, that poor child, And he was, he wanted to stay in touch with me on social media. He was excited, but he slept through the entire talk.
So you won the 2023 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Fiction.
Thank you.
How does that feel?
Well, y'all, I don't know, y'all are probably more used to this, but for writers, we're always in our pajamas, every day. I'm in my pajamas all day long. That's why I don't really post on social media a lot, because I'm people don't want to see what I look like on a given day. I don't brush my teeth, my UPS delivery guy knows that about me. I'm okay. I'm kind of waving at him so he doesn't see me in my little pajamas. And so it's just fun to dress up. As a writer, and not at somebody else's event. We never get a red carpet, really, so it's always fun to dress up. We get a couple of those events every now and then, to actually be there as a winner, because I had been nominated before, and I had been to the ceremony, but I had never been as winner. It was really thrilling. Yeah.
That's great. I have one last quick question.
Okay.
I saw that you have an online book club. What's
Yes.
the club reading now?
Ooh, somebody just asked me that. I'm just starting it. It is, we're going to start up in May. I'll announce the book. And you can sign up on Facebook. That's what we're doing. But I'm probably going to stream it to other media. But the reason I decided to start it is because, people always ask me when I visit a book club, can you get another author? And the thing is, I've been around in the writing world so long that I know everybody. So I have, I can text people and ask them. So I thought, why don't I just start a book club and ask people to appear and talk, and we'll do interviews, chit chats. And so it will be focused around historical fiction that features women protagonists. And
Great.
yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.